The blood dripped from her fingertips onto the snow-covered woodpile, each crimson drop sinking into the white like a confession. She was too tired to speak aloud. Florence Stanton brought the axe down again, her palms screaming in protest. But she couldn't stop because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering how silent this cabin had been for the past 3 weeks. The winter of 1878 had arrived early in the Sierra Nevada foothills, blanketing Coloma, California, in a thick layer of white that made the old mining town feel even more isolated than usual. Most folks had already stocked their firewood before the first snow, but Florence's father had fallen ill in October, and by the time November rolled around, she'd been too busy nursing him to prepare properly. Now he was gone, buried under frozen ground at the edge of their property because the cemetery soil was too hard to break, and she was alone with a dwindling woodpile and hands that had never done this kind of work before. She was 22 years old and had never felt more exhausted in her life. The axe handle slipped in her bloody grip, and the blade glanced off the log, burying itself in the chopping block. Florence stood there for a moment, breathing hard, watching her breath turn to white clouds in the frigid air. Her father's coat hung loose on her frame, and her dark blonde hair had come free from its braid, falling in tangled waves around her face. She knew she looked like something wild and desperate, but there was no one around to see her anyway. That was what she thought, at least, until she heard the horse. Florence's head snapped up, her body tensing instinctively. Visitors were rare out here, especially in winter, and her father's rifle was inside the cabin, too far away to do her any good if whoever was approaching had ill intentions. Her hands tightened on the axe handle, sending fresh pain shooting through her torn palms, but she didn't let go. The rider came around the bend in the path, a tall figure on a buckskin horse that picked its way carefully through the snow. As he drew closer, Florence could make out more details. A man in his mid-20s, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and when he spotted her standing there with the axe, he reined his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Florence kept her chin up despite her exhaustion, refusing to show weakness to this stranger. The man pushed his hat back slightly, revealing dark hair and hazel eyes that widened as they took in the state of her hands. "Madam," he said, his voice low and careful like he was trying not to spook a frightened animal, "you're bleeding." "I'm aware," Florence replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. She hadn't spoken to another person since the day she'd buried her father, and the sound of her own words felt strange in her ears. The man swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, and Florence took an involuntary step back, raising the axe slightly. He froze immediately, holding his hands up where she could see them. "Easy now," he said. "I'm not here to cause you any trouble. Name's Patrick Kane. I work for the Davidson Ranch about 5 miles west of here. I was checking the northern boundary line when I saw smoke from your chimney and figured I'd make sure whoever was out here was all right." His eyes flicked to her hands again, then to the meager pile of split wood beside her. "Looks like maybe you could use some help." "I don't need charity," Florence said automatically, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were ridiculous. She was standing in front of a stranger with bleeding hands and barely enough firewood to last another week, wearing a dead man's coat and probably looking half-starved. If ever there was a person who needed help, it was her. Patrick studied her for a moment and something in his expression softened. "Doesn't have to be charity, could just be neighboring kindness. Your pa around?" The question hit her like a physical blow, and Florence felt her carefully maintained composure crack. She looked away, focusing on a spot somewhere past Patrick's shoulder. "He died 3 weeks ago. Fever." She heard Patrick take a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing to go through alone." He paused, then added carefully, "You got any other family? Anyone who knows you're out here by yourself?" Florence shook her head. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had been an only child. There were some distant cousins back in Ohio, but they hadn't kept in touch, and she doubted they even knew her father had passed. She was truly alone in the world, a realization that still felt surreal every time she confronted it. "All right then," Patrick said, and there was something decisive in his tone now. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to split you some proper firewood, enough to last you a good while, and you're going to go inside and take care of those hands before they get infected. Then we're going to figure out what else you need to get through this winter. And before you argue, let me just say that I've got 2 sisters, and if either of them was out here in your situation, I'd hope someone would do the same for them." Florence wanted to protest, wanted to maintain her pride and independence, but the truth was that she was exhausted and in pain and desperately grateful that someone had appeared to share the burden, even if just for an afternoon. So instead of arguing, she nodded once, set the axe down carefully, and started toward the cabin. "There's salve in the kitchen cabinet," she said over her shoulder, "and coffee if you want some after." She didn't wait to hear his response before pushing through the cabin door and letting it swing shut behind her. Inside, the air was warmer, but not by much. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers while she'd been outside, and she'd need to build it back up soon. But first, she needed to deal with her hands. Florence pumped water into the wash basin with her elbow, gritting her teeth as she submerged her torn palms in the cold liquid. The water turned pink almost immediately, and she had to pump more, rinsing away the blood and dirt until she could see the actual damage. Deep blisters had burst across both palms, and several spots had torn completely open. No wonder the axe had kept slipping. She dried her hands as gently as possible and retrieved the salve her father had always kept for rope burns and minor injuries. As she spread it across her palms, she found herself listening to the steady thwack of the axe outside, the sound rhythmic and reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. It had been so quiet for so long that even this small indication of another human presence made the cabin feel less like a tomb. By the time she'd wrapped her hands in clean strips of cloth torn from an old sheet, the thwacking had stopped. Florence looked out the window and felt her breath catch. The woodpile had at least tripled in size, neat stacks of split logs piled against the side of the cabin. Patrick was loading an armful into the wood box by the door, and as she watched, he made 3 more trips until the box was completely full. Florence hurried to build up the fire, adding several fresh logs until it was crackling nicely and putting out real heat. She put coffee on to brew, using more of their dwindling supply than she normally would have, and by the time Patrick knocked politely on the door, the cabin was starting to feel genuinely warm for the first time in days. "Come in," she called, and the door swung open to admit a gust of cold air along with the cowboy. Patrick stamped the snow off his boots and removed his hat, revealing hair that was slightly damp with sweat despite the cold. Up close and in better light, Florence could see that he had a kind face, angular and weathered from time spent outdoors, with a slight scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He was probably around 25 or 26, and there was something steady about him that made her feel safer than she had in weeks. "Got you enough wood for at least a month, maybe longer if you're careful with it," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door like he'd done it 100 times before. "Your axe needs sharpening, though. I can take it back to the ranch and do it proper if you'd like." "You've done more than enough already," Florence said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Kane." "Patrick," he corrected, accepting the cup she offered. "And you can thank me by telling me your name and letting me know what else needs doing around here before the next storm hits." Florence hesitated, then decided there was no point in being evasive. "Florence Stanton. And honestly, I don't know what all needs doing. My father handled most of the outdoor work, and I was always more help with the cooking and mending. He taught me to shoot and ride, but he never got around to teaching me how to prepare for winter on my own." Patrick sipped his coffee, his eyes taking in the cabin's interior. It was small but well built, with a sleeping loft above and a stone hearth that dominated one wall. There were signs of recent loss everywhere. A man's pipe still sitting on the mantel, 2 plates set on the table as if Florence hadn't quite accepted that she only needed one now, a pair of worn boots by the door that were far too large to be hers. "You planning to stay through winter?" he asked carefully. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Florence admitted. "This land is mine now, and it's all I have left of my father. I can't just abandon it." Patrick nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer. "All right then, here's what I'm thinking. I can come by every few days, make sure you've got what you need, help with the heavy work. The Davidson Ranch keeps me pretty busy, but not so busy I can't spare a few hours here and there. In return, if you're willing, you could do some mending work. We've got about 15 ranch hands, and they're rough on their clothes. Mrs. Davidson tries to keep up with it, but she's getting on in years and her eyes aren't what they used to be." It was a generous offer, far more generous than Florence deserved, and they both knew it. The work she'd be doing in return wouldn't come close to equaling the value of what Patrick was proposing to do for her. But it was also offered in a way that let her keep her pride, framing it as a fair exchange rather than charity. "That seems more than reasonable," Florence said quietly. "Thank you, Patrick." He smiled then, a genuine expression that lit up his whole face and made him look younger. "Good. Now you got enough food to last you. What about feed for animals if you've got any?" "I've got a milk cow in the lean-to out back and some chickens in the coop," Florence said. "The cow's been giving less milk lately, probably because of the cold, but we've still got enough feed for her. Food for me is running low, though. I was planning to go into town before the snow got worse, but I kept putting it off." Patrick frowned slightly. "Coloma's a good 4 miles from here, and that road gets treacherous in winter. Tell you what, I'll bring supplies when I come by. You can settle up with me later or work it off with mending if you prefer." They talked for another hour, Patrick asking questions about the property and what her father had done to maintain it, Florence answering as best she could while they finished the pot of coffee. By the time Patrick stood to leave, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold. "I'll be back day after tomorrow," Patrick said, settling his hat back on his head. "You need anything before then, there's a ranch hand named Tommy who rides the northern boundary every morning. You see him, you tell him to fetch me. Understand?" Florence nodded, following him to the door. "I understand, and Patrick, thank you, really." He paused on the threshold, turning back to look at her. In the fading light, his eyes looked more gold than hazel, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart beat a little faster. "No thanks necessary," he said softly. "Nobody should have to face winter alone." Then he was gone, swinging up onto his horse and riding back the way he'd come, leaving Florence standing in the doorway watching until he disappeared around the bend. Only then did she close the door, leaning back against it and releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since her father died, the silence of the cabin didn't feel quite so oppressive. The fire crackled cheerfully, the woodbox was full, and her bandaged hands had stopped hurting quite so badly. More than that, she had something to look forward to. Patrick's return in 2 days, another human voice to break the monotony of her isolation. Florence moved through the evening routine mechanically, feeding the chickens and milking the cow, preparing a simple supper of cornbread and the last of yesterday's stew. But her mind kept drifting back to the cowboy, who'd appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to voice. He'd been kind without being condescending, helpful without making her feel helpless, and there'd been something in the way he looked at her that suggested he saw a person worth helping rather than a charity case to be pitied. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks, the cabin warm and secure around her, the memory of Patrick's steady presence keeping the worst of the loneliness at bay. True to his word, Patrick returned 2 days later, his saddlebags loaded with supplies. He brought flour and sugar, coffee and salt pork, dried beans, and even a small sack of apples that must have cost a fortune this time of year. He also brought the ranch's mending, 2 enormous bags of shirts and trousers that needed everything from simple button replacements to complete repatching of worn-through knees and elbows. Mrs. Davidson picked out what she thought was most urgent, Patrick explained as he helped Florence carry everything inside. But there's no rush on getting it done. Just work on it as you're able. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Patrick would arrive every few days, always with some task he claimed needed doing. Checking the roof for weak spots, reinforcing the chicken coop against predators, splitting more firewood even though the pile was still substantial. Florence would feed him whatever meal corresponded with his arrival time and send him home with a stack of mended clothing, both of them maintaining the fiction that this was an equal exchange. But something else was growing between them too, something neither of them quite knew how to name. It started with small things. The way Patrick's face would light up when he came around the bend and saw her waiting by the cabin. The way Florence found herself taking extra care with her appearance on the days she expected him, pinning her hair up neatly and wearing her better dress instead of her work clothes. Their conversations grew longer and more personal. Patrick told her about growing up on his family's ranch in Nevada, how he'd left at 18 to see more of the world and ended up working his way through California, Colorado, and Montana before settling at the Davidson Ranch. He talked about his sisters with obvious affection, his mother who died when he was young, his father who'd remarried a woman Patrick had never quite gotten along with. Florence shared her own history. Growing up as an only child, moving to California with her parents when she was 15 after her father had heard about opportunities in the gold country. The mining hadn't panned out the way he'd hoped, but they'd made a life here anyway. Her father taking work as a carpenter while they worked their small plot of land. She told him about her mother's death, the years of just her and her father building a quiet life together, and how unprepared she'd been to suddenly lose him too. "I keep expecting to hear him call for supper," she admitted one afternoon as they sat by the fire, Florence mending a shirt while Patrick oiled the hinges on her door. "Or to wake up and find him at the table reading his newspaper. It doesn't feel real yet that he's actually gone." Patrick looked up from his work, his expression understanding. "Grief's a strange thing. It comes and goes like the tide. Some days you think you're fine, and then something small will hit you and you'll feel like you're drowning all over again. You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Lost my mother when I was 16, Patrick said quietly. "Pneumonia took her in less than a week. I was angry for a long time after, felt like the world was cruel and unfair for taking her when she was still so young. My father couldn't handle seeing me like that, which is part of why I left when I did. Needed to figure out how to live with it on my own terms. Florence set down her mending, giving him her full attention. Did you figure it out, I mean? Patrick considered the question, his hand still working at the hinge. I don't know if you ever fully figure it out, but I learned that carrying grief doesn't mean you can't also carry joy, that you can miss someone terribly and still find reasons to be grateful for the life you have. That the people we love don't really leave us as long as we remember them. It was the most philosophical Florence had ever heard him be, and there was something raw in his voice that made her want to cross the small space between them and offer comfort. But she stayed where she was, somehow knowing that Patrick was the type of man who needed to offer his vulnerability as a gift rather than having it taken from him. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "It helps, knowing I'm not alone in feeling this way." Patrick's eyes met hers across the cabin, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. "You're not alone, Florence. Not anymore." The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the connection that had been building between them for weeks. Florence felt her heart speed up, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Before either of them could say anything more, they heard the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders by the sound of it. Patrick was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip, and Florence felt a flutter of fear. Visitors were still rare, and multiple riders usually meant trouble. Patrick moved to the window, peering out carefully. His posture relaxed slightly, but he didn't move away from the gun. "Looks like Davidson and a couple of the ranch hands. Wonder what brings them out here." Florence joined him at the window, watching as 3 men rode into the clearing. She recognized Robert Davidson, the rancher Patrick worked for, from seeing him in town a few times. He was in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and a bearing that spoke of authority tempered by fairness. Patrick opened the door and stepped out, Florence following behind him. Davidson dismounted with the stiffness of a man whose joints were starting to protest the cold, nodding to both of them. "Patrick." "Miss Stanton," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who'd spent his life shouting over wind and cattle. "Sorry to intrude, but I thought you should both hear this from me directly. We've had reports of a group of men operating in the area, claiming to be bounty hunters but acting more like common thieves. They've been hitting isolated properties, taking what they want and roughing up anyone who resists. Sheriff in Coloma asked me to spread the word to anyone living out away from town." Florence felt the blood drain from her face. Her property was about as isolated as it got, and she was exactly the kind of target such men would be looking for. A woman alone with no one to protect her. Patrick's expression had gone hard, his jaw clenched. "How many men are we talking about? Reports vary, but seems like there's 4 or 5 of them. They hit the Henderson place 3 days ago, took their winter stores and 2 horses. Mr. Henderson tried to stop them and got a broken arm for his trouble. Mrs. Henderson was smart enough to take their kids and hide in the root cellar until they left." "Do we know which direction they're heading?" Patrick asked. Davidson shook his head. "They seem to be moving around pretty randomly, which makes them harder to track. Sheriff's trying to organize a group to hunt them down, but that takes time. Meanwhile, folks need to be careful." His eyes settled on Florence with concern. "Miss Stanton, I hate to speak plainly, but you're particularly vulnerable out here. Have you thought about moving into town until this is resolved?" Florence lifted her chin, that stubborn pride rising up again. "This is my home. I'm not going to let some outlaws drive me away from it." "I understand your feelings, but pride isn't worth your life," Davidson said, not unkindly. At least consider staying with friends or family just temporarily. I don't have any friends or family in town, Florence admitted, and I can't afford to rent a room at the boarding house. Patrick had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice firm. Then she'll stay at the ranch. We've got that empty room off the kitchen where the previous cook used to sleep. She'll be safe there, and Mrs. Davidson could probably use the company anyway. Davidson considered this, then nodded. That's a fine solution if Miss Stanton is agreeable to it. All eyes turned to Florence, who felt trapped between practicality and pride. She didn't want to leave her home, the last physical connection she had to her father. But she also wasn't foolish enough to think she could defend herself against 4 or 5 armed men with ill intentions. And if she was being honest, the thought of sleeping at the ranch, where Patrick would be nearby, wasn't entirely unwelcome. "I'll need to bring my cow and chickens," she said finally. "I can't just leave them here to starve or be stolen." "We'll transport them today," Patrick said immediately. "I can come back tomorrow with a wagon for your personal belongings, whatever you want to bring with you." They moved quickly after that, Patrick and the ranch hands helping Florence gather the chickens into crates and coaxing her reluctant milk cow into following them. Florence packed a bag with her most essential items, including her father's rifle and the small wooden box where she kept her mother's jewelry and her parents' wedding certificate. Within 2 hours, they were ready to leave. Florence took one last look at the cabin before mounting the horse Patrick had brought for her. It looked small and lonely sitting in the clearing, smoke no longer rising from the chimney, snow already starting to pile up on the porch where their feet had kept it clear. She felt like she was abandoning her father all over again, leaving him alone in his grave while she fled to safety. As if sensing her thoughts, Patrick brought his horse alongside hers. "It's just temporary," he said quietly. "Once those men are caught or move on, you can come back. The cabin will still be here waiting for you." Florence nodded, not trusting her voice, and urged her horse forward to follow Davidson and the ranch hands. Patrick fell in beside her, a steady presence that helped keep her emotions in check as they made the journey to the ranch. The Davidson ranch was impressive, a sprawling operation with a large main house, multiple barns, and a bunkhouse for the hands. Mrs. Davidson met them at the main house, a petite woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Florence's face and immediately shifted into mothering mode, bustling her inside and insisting she have something hot to drink and a proper meal. "Don't you worry about a thing, dear," Mrs. Davidson said, leading Florence to a small but comfortable room off the kitchen. "You'll be perfectly safe here, and it'll be nice to have another woman around the place. Gets tiresome being surrounded by men all the time, even when they're mostly respectful." The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out over the ranch yard. Florence set her bag down and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. It wasn't home, but it was safe, and that counted for a lot right now. Over the following days, Florence settled into a routine at the ranch. She helped Mrs. Davidson with cooking and cleaning, continued her mending work for the ranch hands, and tried not to feel like a burden despite everyone's assurances that she was earning her keep. The other men on the ranch were polite, but kept their distance, sensing perhaps that Patrick had some sort of claim on her, even if nothing had been explicitly stated. Patrick himself seemed to be around more than usual, always finding reasons to be near the main house rather than out on the range. He'd take his meals in the kitchen where Florence and Mrs. Davidson ate instead of with the other hands in the bunkhouse. He'd appear in the evening to help with chores that didn't really need his help. And every night, he'd make a point of checking that Florence's window was securely latched before heading to the bunkhouse, a ritual that made her feel protected rather than patronized. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Florence was helping Mrs. Davidson with the dinner dishes when the older woman fixed her with a knowing look. "That boy is sweet on you, you know," she said matter-of-factly, scrubbing at a stubborn pot. Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Patrick's just being kind. He feels responsible for me because he was the one who found me." Mrs. Davidson made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort. "I've known Patrick Kane for 3 years now, ever since he started working for us. He's kind to everyone, that's true. But the way he looks at you isn't kindness, dear. That's something else entirely." Florence kept her eyes on the plate she was drying, afraid that if she met Mrs. Davidson's gaze, the older woman would see too much. "Even if that were true, I have nothing to offer him. I'm a woman with no family, no prospects, living on his employer's charity. What kind of future could we possibly have?" "The kind you build together," Mrs. Davidson said simply. "Love doesn't care much about prospects or property in my experience. It just cares about whether two people are willing to take a chance on each other." She paused, then added more gently, "Your father's death is still fresh, and I'm not suggesting you rush into anything. But don't let grief or pride keep you from seeing what's right in front of you. Life's too short and happiness too rare to push it away when it comes knocking." That night, Florence lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Mrs. Davidson's words. She couldn't deny that something had developed between her and Patrick, a connection that went beyond simple friendship or gratitude. She thought about him constantly when he wasn't around, felt her heart lift every time he appeared, found herself noticing small things like the way his hands moved when he worked or the rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. But was it real, or was she just clinging to the first person who'd shown her kindness in her darkest moment? Was he genuinely interested in her, or was he simply being protective because it was in his nature? And even if they both felt something real, was it fair to act on it when everything in her life was so uncertain? She didn't have answers to any of these questions, so she did what she'd been doing for weeks. She pushed them aside and focused on getting through each day as it came. Another week passed, and word came that the sheriff had caught 2 of the outlaws who'd been terrorizing the area. The other 3 had apparently moved on, heading south toward Sacramento. The threat wasn't entirely gone, but it was significantly reduced. Florence knew she should be planning to return to her cabin, but she found herself reluctant to leave the ranch, to give up the daily proximity to Patrick and the sense of community she'd found here. The decision was made for her when a heavy storm rolled in, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow over 3 days and making travel impossible. Everyone hunkered down to wait it out, the ranch hands staying in the bunkhouse, the Davidsons and Florence in the main house. Patrick volunteered to help with the indoor work, claiming the bunkhouse was too loud and crowded for his taste, but Florence suspected it had more to do with wanting to be near her. On the second day of the storm, Florence was in the kitchen preparing bread dough when Patrick came in from checking on the animals in the barn. He was covered in snow, his coat and hat white with it, and his teeth were chattering slightly. "Good Lord, you're half frozen," Florence said, immediately moving toward the stove. "Get that wet coat off and sit by the fire. I'll make coffee." Patrick did as he was told, hanging his coat to dry and settling into the chair nearest the stove with a grateful sigh. Florence worked quickly, heating water and measuring out coffee grounds, hyper-aware of Patrick's presence behind her. They were alone in the kitchen, Mrs. Davidson having gone upstairs for her afternoon rest and Mr. Davidson in his study working on accounts. "Storm like this makes you appreciate solid walls and a warm fire," Patrick said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. I keep thinking about your cabin out there, wondering if the roof's holding up under all this snow. Florence had been trying not to think about exactly that. I'm sure it's fine. My father built it well. Still, I'll check on it as soon as the weather clears. Make sure no damage was done, air the place out, get a fire going to ward off the damp. He paused, then added quietly, though I have to admit, I'm in no hurry for this storm to end if it means you'll be leaving. Florence's hands stilled in the bread dough. She looked up to find Patrick watching her with an expression so open and vulnerable that it made her breath catch. Patrick. He set down his coffee cup and stood, crossing the small distance between them. They were closer than they'd ever been, close enough that Florence could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I know this probably isn't the right time, Patrick said, his voice low and rough with emotion. I know you're still grieving your father and you've got enough to worry about without me adding to it. But Florence, I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel. These past weeks with you, getting to know you, watching you be so brave and stubborn and kind even when everything's falling apart around you. I've fallen for you. Hard. And if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I need to know. Because if there's not, I need to start figuring out how to be just your friend instead of wanting more. Florence's heart was racing, her flour-covered hands forgotten in the bread dough. She'd imagined this conversation a dozen different ways in the quiet hours of night, but now that it was actually happening, she found herself terrified. Not of Patrick, but of the intensity of her own feelings, of how much she wanted to close the distance between them and let herself fall completely. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything I've counted on has been taken away. My mother, my father, my home, my sense of security. You're the one stable thing in my life right now, and I'm terrified that if I let myself care for you the way I want to, something will happen to take you away too. Patrick reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm against her cheeks, slightly rough with calluses, infinitely gentle. I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that I'm not going anywhere by choice, that I'll be here as long as you'll have me, that whatever comes, we'll face it together instead of alone. A tear slipped down Florence's cheek, and Patrick brushed it away with his thumb. She let herself lean into his touch, let herself believe in the possibility of happiness again. I feel it too, she said, the words coming out shaky but certain. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was too soon or too complicated, but I can't help it. I've fallen for you too, Patrick Kane. The smile that broke across Patrick's face was brilliant, joy and relief mixed together in equal measure. He leaned forward, moving slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Florence didn't want to change her mind. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to feel something other than grief and fear for once. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. Florence's flour-covered hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something hungrier and more urgent. It was her first kiss, though she didn't tell him that, and it felt like something breaking open inside her chest, letting light into places that had been dark for too long. They broke apart when they heard footsteps on the stairs, both of them slightly breathless, Florence's cheeks flushed pink. Patrick stepped back but kept one hand on her waist, as if he couldn't quite bear to let her go completely. Mrs. Davidson appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at them, and smiled knowingly. "About time," was all she said, before moving past them to start preparations for dinner. After that, things changed between Florence and Patrick. Not dramatically, but in small, significant ways. He'd find excuses to touch her in passing, a hand on her back as he moved around her in the kitchen, fingers brushing hers when he handed her something. She'd save him the best portions at meals and mend his clothes with extra care, adding decorative stitching that wasn't strictly necessary, but that she knew he'd notice and appreciate. When the storm finally cleared, Patrick did go check on Florence's cabin as promised. He returned with good news. The structure was sound, no damage done, though everything inside would need to be aired out and warmed up before it was livable again. He also brought something else, a small carved wooden bird that he'd found on Florence's mantelpiece. "I remember you mentioning your father made this for you when you were small," Patrick said, pressing it into her hands. "Thought you might want to have it with you." Florence ran her fingers over the smooth wood, remembering the day her father had given it to her, how proud he'd been of his handiwork. The grief rose up sharp and immediate, but it was tempered now by other emotions. Gratitude for Patrick's thoughtfulness, hope for the future they might build together, love for the man standing in front of her looking nervous, like he wasn't sure his gesture had been welcome. "Thank you," she said, rising on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. "This means more than you know." As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the question of Florence's return to her cabin became more pressing. Part of her wanted to reclaim her independence, to prove she could survive on her own. But another part, the part that was growing stronger every day, didn't want to leave the ranch and the life she was building here. Didn't want to be separated from Patrick, who had become as essential to her happiness as food and water and air. The decision was made easier when Mr. Davidson approached her one evening with a proposal. They were in need of a permanent cook and housekeeper, he explained. Mrs. Davidson's arthritis was getting worse, making the daily work harder for her, but she was too proud to admit she needed help. If Florence would agree to take on the role permanently, they'd pay her a fair wage and she could continue living in the room off the kitchen. "It would be a real help to us," Mr. Davidson said, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "And it would ease my mind knowing you're not out there alone anymore. But if you'd rather go back to your own place, I'll understand. Just know the offer stands whenever you're ready." Florence accepted immediately, relief and happiness flooding through her. It was the solution she'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to ask for, a way to stay close to Patrick while maintaining her independence and earning her own way. That night, she and Patrick took a walk around the ranch property despite the cold, both of them needing to talk away from other ears. The moon was bright overhead, turning the remaining snow silver, and their breath made white clouds in the air between them. "I'm glad you're staying," Patrick said, his hand warm in hers. "I was dreading the day you'd tell me you were going back to the cabin." "I'll still visit it sometimes," Florence said. "Make sure it's maintained, tend my father's grave, but this feels like where I belong now, here with you." Patrick stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Florence, I know we've only known each other a few months, and by all rights that's not long enough to be certain of anything. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about you. About us. And I need you to know that my intentions are honorable. I'm not looking for something temporary or casual. I'm looking for forever if you'll have me." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "I want forever too, with you." They stood there in the moonlight, holding hands and making silent promises to each other, and Florence thought about how strange life was. 3 months ago, she'd been alone and desperate, bleeding into the snow with no hope for the future. Now she had Patrick, had a home and a job and a community, had love that felt like it might be strong enough to last. The rest of winter passed quickly, spring arriving with the first wildflowers pushing up through the melting snow. Florence continued her work at the ranch, settling into her role and earning the respect and affection of everyone there. She and Patrick were openly courting now, spending every spare moment together, and no one seemed surprised when Patrick started talking about building a small house on ranch property where they could live after they married. The wedding took place in late May, when the California hills were green and covered in wildflowers. It was a simple ceremony in Coloma's small church, with the Davidsons and all the ranch hands in attendance, along with a few people from town who'd known Florence's father. Florence wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Patrick had gathered for her that morning. As she walked down the aisle toward Patrick, seeing the love and wonder on his face, Florence felt her father's absence keenly. But she also felt his presence in a way, felt certain that he would have approved of this match, would have been happy knowing she'd found someone who would take care of her and love her the way she deserved. Patrick's vows were simple and heartfelt, promising to love her through joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, all the days of his life. Florence's vows echoed his, her voice strong and clear despite the tears streaming down her face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Patrick kissed her, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed twice as many people as were actually there. There was music and dancing, and Florence found herself passed from partner to partner, spun around until she was dizzy and laughing. But her eyes kept finding Patrick across the crowd, and every time their gazes met, she felt that same flutter of happiness and disbelief that this was her life now. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Patrick took her hand and led her away from the crowd to the small house he'd been building. It wasn't finished yet, still missing interior walls and some of the roof trim, but it was far enough along to be functional. He'd spent the day making it presentable, moving in the few pieces of furniture they'd accumulated and hanging curtains in the windows. "It's not much yet," Patrick said, suddenly nervous as he showed her around. "But it's ours. We can fix it up however you want, make it into a real home." Florence turned in a slow circle, taking in the open space that would become their living area, the corner where the stove would go, the loft where they'd sleep. It smelled of fresh-cut lumber and possibility, and she could picture so clearly the life they'd build here together. "It's perfect," she said, moving into his arms. "You're perfect. All of this is more than I ever dreamed I could have." Patrick held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "You saved me too, you know. I didn't realize how lonely I'd been until I met you. How much I was just going through the motions of living without really being alive. You changed everything for me, Florence Kane." She tilted her head back to kiss him, and he responded eagerly, lifting her into his arms and carrying her toward the ladder that led to the loft. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and wonderful, full of whispered endearments and gentle discoveries. And when Florence finally fell asleep in Patrick's arms, she felt safe and loved in a way she'd never expected to feel again. The first year of their marriage was full of hard work and simple joys. Patrick continued his work at the Davidson Ranch while slowly building up a small herd of his own cattle, planning toward the day when he might run his own operation. Florence managed the household for the Davidsons while also making their small house into a home, sewing curtains and braiding rugs, and planting a garden that flourished under her care. They visited her father's grave regularly, Florence telling him about her life and introducing Patrick properly, talking through her grief until it became something she could carry without it weighing her down quite so much. Patrick helped her maintain the cabin, and eventually they rented it to a young family new to the area, the income giving them a little extra security. Their first real test came in the winter of their second year together, when Florence fell seriously ill with influenza. For 5 terrifying days, Patrick barely left her side, spooning broth into her when she could keep it down, bathing her forehead with cool cloths when the fever raged, praying in a way he hadn't since he was a child that God wouldn't take her from him so soon. On the 6th day, the fever broke, and Florence woke to find Patrick asleep in the chair beside their bed, his hand still holding hers, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. She squeezed his fingers weakly, and his eyes flew open, relief flooding his features when he saw her looking back at him with clear eyes. "You scared me half to death," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I'm sorry," Florence whispered, "but I'm all right now. I'm not going anywhere." Patrick climbed into bed beside her, gathering her carefully into his arms, and she felt him shaking. "I can't lose you," he said into her hair. "I can't. You're everything to me." "You won't lose me," she promised, though they both knew it was a promise no one could really make. "We've got years and years ahead of us yet." And they did. Florence recovered slowly but completely, and by spring she was back to her full strength and energy. That summer, she discovered she was pregnant, news that sent Patrick into a state of excited panic. He immediately became overly protective, trying to stop her from doing any work he deemed too strenuous, driving her to distraction with his hovering, until she finally had to sit him down and explain that pregnancy wasn't an illness, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. Their first child, a son they named Peter, was born in January of 1881, arriving during a cold snap that had Patrick frantically stoking the fire to keep the house warm enough. The labor was long and difficult with Mrs. Davidson serving as midwife, and there were moments when Patrick was certain something had gone terribly wrong. But finally, after hours that felt like days, he heard his son's first cry, thin and indignant, and Mrs. Davidson was placing a tiny, red-faced bundle in his arms. "You've got a healthy boy," she said with a tired smile. "And your wife is just fine, though she's exhausted. Let me get her cleaned up and then you can see her." Patrick looked down at his son, at the tiny perfect fingers and the wisps of dark hair, and felt something shift in his chest. This was his child, his and Florence's, a whole new person who hadn't existed before and who would carry their legacy into the future. The responsibility of it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. When he was finally allowed to see Florence, she was propped up in their bed, pale and exhausted but smiling. He sat beside her carefully, still holding their son, and she reached out to touch the baby's cheek with one finger. "We made him," she said wonderingly. "Can you believe it? We made this perfect little person." "He's got your nose," Patrick said, which made Florence laugh. "Poor child, stuck with my nose. Let's hope he gets your eyes at least." They sat together for a long time, marveling over their son, taking turns holding him, making grand plans for his future. Patrick promised to teach him to ride and rope and shoot, to be a good man who treated people with respect. Florence talked about teaching him to read and appreciate beauty, to be kind and thoughtful. They were both perhaps overly optimistic about their parenting abilities, but in that moment, anything seemed possible. Peter turned out to be a healthy, happy baby who grew like a weed and had his father's hazel eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. By the time he was a year old, he was walking and getting into everything, and Florence discovered she was pregnant again. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary, was born in late 1882, an easier birth than Peter's had been. She had Florence's blonde hair and Patrick's serious expression, and from the start, she and Peter were inseparable. The years rolled by, full and busy and happy. Patrick's cattle operation grew until he was able to cut back his hours working for the Davidsons, focusing more on his own land and herd. Florence continued her work as long as she was able, but eventually, Mrs. Davidson insisted she should focus on her own family, especially as their household grew. A third child, another son named James, arrived in 1885, completing their family. Florence sometimes thought about that winter day when Patrick had found her, bleeding and desperate and so terribly alone. It felt like another lifetime, like it had happened to a different person entirely. She'd been so broken then, so certain that happiness was something that happened to other people, not to her. But she'd been wrong. Happiness had found her anyway in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes who'd stopped to help when he could have just as easily ridden on by. Their house grew with their family, Patrick adding rooms as they needed them, until it was a sprawling, comfortable home filled with the noise and chaos of children. The original cabin on Florence's father's property became a place they visited on special occasions, maintaining it carefully but no longer living there. Florence still tended her father's grave, bringing the children with her to tell them stories about their grandfather, making sure he remained a presence in their lives even though he'd never met them. The Davidson Ranch remained an important part of their lives. Mr. Davidson passed away in 1889, but Mrs. Davidson lived for many more years, serving as a beloved grandmother figure to Peter, Mary, and James. She'd been right all those years ago when she'd told Florence that love didn't care about prospects or property. All that mattered was being willing to take a chance, and Florence had never regretted taking that chance with Patrick. As their children grew older, Peter showing an interest in ranching like his father, Mary developing a talent for drawing and painting, James proving to be the adventurous one who was always getting into scrapes, Florence and Patrick's partnership deepened. They'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that swept through the community, financial pressures, and the endless challenges of raising children. But through it all, they'd had each other, that foundation of love and trust that had been built in those early months when everything had been so uncertain. One evening in the spring of 1895, when Peter was 14 and already taller than his father, Mary was 12 and showing her latest drawings to anyone who would look, and James was 10 and sporting a black eye from a fight at school, Florence and Patrick sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set over the hills. The children were inside, arguing good-naturedly over something or other, their voices carrying clearly through the open windows. "You ever miss the quiet?" Patrick asked, though his tone made it clear he was joking. Florence laughed. "Not for a second. Though I wouldn't mind if James would stop coming home injured quite so often. My heart can't take much more of it. He's just high-spirited. He'll settle down eventually." Patrick reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "You know, I was thinking today about the first time I saw you, standing there in the snow with blood on your hands and the most stubborn expression on your face, refusing to admit you needed help." "I was a mess," Florence said, shaking her head at the memory. "You were beautiful." "You are beautiful. And stubborn, yes, but that stubbornness is part of why I fell for you. You don't give up, even when things are impossible. You just keep going, keep fighting, keep finding ways to survive." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're the strongest person I know, Florence Kane." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from being seen and loved exactly as she was. "I'm only strong because I have you. Before you came along, I was barely holding on. You gave me a reason to keep going, to build something instead of just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Inside, The children's argument had resolved itself, and now Mary was playing a simple tune on the piano they'd saved for months to buy. It was off-key in places, but it was theirs, this life they'd built from almost nothing. "You think we've done all right?" Patrick asked quietly. "By the children, by each other, by the promises we made?" Florence turned to look at him fully, at the man who'd saved her in more ways than one, who'd given her a family and a future and love that had only grown stronger with time. His dark hair was starting to show threads of gray now, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd first met, but he was still the same Patrick who'd stopped to help a stranger in need, who'd seen past her desperate circumstances to the person underneath. "We've done better than all right," she said firmly. "We've done beautifully. Look at what we've built, Patrick. 3 healthy, happy children, a home, a life. We started with nothing but hope and determination, and look at us now." Patrick smiled, that full, genuine smile that still made her heart skip a beat even after all these years. He leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet, a reaffirmation of everything they were to each other. "I love you," he said. "From that first day to this one, to whatever days we have left ahead of us. You're my heart, Florence." "And you're mine," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and they went inside to their noisy, chaotic, perfect family, closing the door on another day. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, as would the day after that and all the days beyond. But Florence knew that whatever came, they'd face it together, just as Patrick had promised all those years ago when he'd found her alone in the snow. The children grew up strong and healthy, each finding their own path in life. Peter took over more of the ranch operation, as Patrick's joints started to protest the hard physical work, eventually marrying a local girl and giving them their first grandchild in 1902. Mary's artistic talents earned her a scholarship to a school in San Francisco, where she studied and eventually became a respected illustrator, though she never strayed too far from home for too long. James, true to his adventurous nature, spent several years traveling before returning to Coloma to settle down, opening a general store that quickly became the heart of the community. Patrick and Florence aged together, their love maturing into something deep and unshakable. They celebrated 20 years of marriage, then 30, then 40, each milestone feeling like both an accomplishment and a blessing. They became grandparents many times over, their house once again filled with the sound of children, though this time it was grandchildren coming to visit, bringing noise and energy and joy. On a spring morning in 1918, nearly 40 years after that day in the snow, Florence woke early and found Patrick already awake beside her, watching her with that same intensity he'd always had. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, beautiful," he replied, reaching out to brush a strand of silver hair from her face. They were both in their 60s now, their bodies slower and more prone to aches and pains, but the love between them had never dimmed. They got up and went through their morning routine, a dance they'd perfected over decades of practice. Florence made coffee while Patrick went out to check on the animals. They ate breakfast together at the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, talking about their plans for the day, about the letter they'd received from Mary, about the upcoming visit from Peter and his family. Later that morning, they walked together to visit her father's grave, something they still did regularly even though so many years had passed. The headstone was weathered now, the carved letters worn but still legible. Florence placed fresh wildflowers at the base, as she always did, and stood silently for a moment. "I wish you could have met them all, Papa," she said softly. "The children and grandchildren, They're all so wonderful, so full of life. I think you'd be proud of the family we've built." She paused, then added, "And thank you for raising me to be strong enough to survive that winter. If I'd given up, if I'd let the grief consume me, I never would have found all this happiness. I never would have found Patrick." Patrick's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. They stood together in the quiet cemetery, paying respects to the past while being grateful for the present. Then they walked back home, hand in hand, to the life they'd built together from snow and blood and stubborn hope. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Florence thought about the journey that had brought them here. The grief and loss, yes, but also the unexpected joy, the love that had grown from the darkest moment of her life. She thought about the girl she'd been, alone and desperate, certain she'd never be happy again. If she could go back and tell that girl what was coming, that the cowboy who stopped to help would become her whole world, that they'd build a family and a life together that would span decades, she wasn't sure that girl would have believed it. But it had all happened anyway, this beautiful, improbable story. And as Patrick reached over to take her hand, their fingers fitting together as perfectly as they had the first time he'd held her hand all those years ago, Florence felt nothing but gratitude for every single day that had brought them to this moment. They had their challenges over the years that followed, as all couples do. There were disagreements and hard times, periods of financial stress and family difficulties that tested them. But through it all, the foundation they'd built held strong. They'd learned early on that loving someone meant choosing them again and again, through the mundane days and the difficult ones, not just during the easy moments when love felt effortless. In 1922, they celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and even 1 great-grandchild, a baby girl who bore Florence's name. The party was held at the ranch, which Peter now ran with his own sons helping him. There was music and dancing and so much food that the tables groaned under the weight of it all. Florence, now 66 years old, found herself swept onto the makeshift dance floor by Patrick, who despite his age could still move with grace. "We did it," he said as they swayed together to music played by James's youngest son on a fiddle. "We built something that'll outlast us, something good and strong and true." Florence looked around at their descendants, at the family they'd created together, and felt overwhelming contentment. "We did indeed, and to think it all started because you couldn't ride past a woman who needed help. Best decision I ever made stopping that day," Patrick said. "Changed my whole life, gave me everything that matters." They danced until Florence's feet hurt and Patrick's knees protested, and then they sat together at a table, accepting congratulations and watching their family enjoy themselves. Mary gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure, talking about her parents' love story and how it had set the standard for what she looked for in her own relationships. Peter spoke about the values his parents had instilled in him: hard work, integrity, compassion, and the importance of family. James, ever the storyteller, recounted humorous anecdotes from their childhood that had even Patrick and Florence laughing at memories they'd half forgotten. As the party wound down and people began to leave, Florence felt Patrick's hand find hers under the table. She looked over at him and saw her own contentment reflected in his eyes. They didn't need to speak. After 43 years together, they rarely did when emotions ran deep. They simply sat together, hand in hand, grateful for every moment that had brought them here. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mixture of joys and sorrows. They lost Mrs. Davidson in 1924, a woman who'd been like a mother to Florence and had been instrumental in bringing her and Patrick together. They grieved her passing, but also celebrated her long, well-lived life. They welcomed more great-grandchildren into the world, each new birth a reminder that their legacy would continue long after they were gone. In the summer of 1928, on a hot July day, Patrick and Florence celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 70s now, moving slower, tiring more easily, but still deeply devoted to each other. The party was even larger than the one for their 43rd anniversary, with family traveling from all over California to celebrate with them. Someone had the idea to recreate their wedding photograph, and though both of them protested that they were far too old and weathered, they eventually agreed. Looking at the two photographs side by side, young and old, Florence marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The faces were different, yes, marked by age and experience, but the love in their eyes, the way they looked at each other, that had remained constant across 5 decades. Patrick's health began to decline in the winter of 1929. Nothing specific at first, just a general slowing down, a loss of appetite, fatigue that didn't improve with rest. Florence fussed over him constantly, making his favorite meals, ensuring he stayed warm, insisting the doctor visit regularly. The doctor couldn't find anything definitively wrong, just said it was age catching up, the body beginning to wear out after 74 years of hard use. Patrick bore it all with characteristic patience, though Florence could see his frustration at not being able to do the things he'd always done. He could no longer ride out to check on the cattle, could barely make it to the barn and back without needing to rest. But he never complained, simply adjusted to his new limitations and found other ways to be useful, sitting on the porch and directing the ranch hands, helping the grandchildren with their homework, spending long hours in conversation with Florence. On a cold morning in February of 1930, Florence woke to find Patrick's side of the bed empty. Panic seized her immediately, and she called his name as she got up and searched the house. She found him sitting in his chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over the hills he'd loved his whole life. "Patrick, you scared me," she said, moving to his side. "What are you doing up so early?" He reached for her hand, pulling her down to sit on the arm of his chair. "Couldn't sleep. Been thinking about things. About my life, our life together. Wanted to watch one more sunrise." Something in his tone frightened her, a finality that she didn't want to acknowledge. "One more, don't talk like that. You'll watch hundreds more sunrises." Patrick smiled gently and squeezed her hand. "Florence, love, we both know my time's running short. I can feel it. And I'm not afraid, not really. I've had more happiness than one man deserves, more love than I ever thought possible. I've watched my children grow up strong and good. I've held my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I've spent 51 years married to the woman I loved from the moment I saw her standing in the snow, too stubborn to admit she needed help." Tears were streaming down Florence's face now, but she didn't try to stop them. "I'm not ready to lose you. I don't know how to be without you." "Yes, you do," Patrick said firmly. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. You survived losing your parents, survived that winter alone, built a whole life from almost nothing. You'll survive losing me too, though I'm sorry I have to leave you." He reached up to cup her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb just as he had that day in the kitchen when they'd first confessed their feelings. "But I won't be truly gone, you know. I'll be in the ranch we built together, in our children and grandchildren, in every sunset over these hills, in every memory we made. As long as you remember me, I'm still here." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, Patrick's breathing gradually becoming more labored. Florence called for Peter, who lived closest, and within an hour the house was full of family, everyone understanding without being told that this was goodbye. Patrick held court from his chair, speaking to each of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, imparting final wisdom and love. He told Peter he was proud of the man and rancher he'd become, told Mary her art had brought beauty into the world, told James his adventurous spirit had enriched all their lives. As evening approached and the family reluctantly began to leave, understanding that Patrick needed rest, Florence helped him back to bed. She lay down beside him, curled into his side the way she had for more than 50 years, and felt his arm come around her one last time. "Thank you," Patrick whispered into the darkness, "for saying yes, for building this life with me, for 51 years of happiness. I love you, Florence, always have, always will." "I love you too," Florence replied, her voice breaking, "more than I could ever put into words." "You saved me, Patrick Kane, in every way a person can be saved." She felt him smile against her hair, felt his chest rise and fall with each breath. Sometime in the night, those breaths grew farther apart, gentler, until finally they stopped altogether. Patrick Kane passed peacefully in his sleep, held in the arms of the woman he'd loved for more than half his life, in the bed they'd shared in the house he'd built for her all those years ago. Florence didn't move for a long time after she realized he was gone. She simply lay there, memorizing the feel of him one last time, saying her own goodbye to the man who'd been her partner, her love, her everything. When the sun finally rose on a world without Patrick Kane in it, Florence got up and began the painful process of letting him go. The funeral was held on a bright February day, the kind of day Patrick had always loved. What felt like the entire community turned out to pay their respects to a man who'd been known for his kindness, integrity, and the deep love he'd had for his family. Florence stood strong throughout the service, though inside she felt broken in ways she hadn't since her father's death 52 years earlier. She listened to people talk about Patrick's impact on their lives, about his generosity and steadiness, about the legacy he'd left behind. He was buried in the Coloma Cemetery not far from her parents' graves. The headstone read simply, "Patrick Kane, beloved husband, father, and friend, 1855–1930. But Florence knew that no stone could truly capture who he'd been, the life he'd lived, the love he'd given so freely. The months after Patrick's death were some of the hardest of Florence's life. She'd known grief before, but losing Patrick was different. He'd been her partner for so long that she'd forgotten how to be just herself instead of half of a pair. The house felt too empty, too quiet, despite regular visits from family. She'd reach for him in the night and find only empty space. She'd turn to tell him something interesting and remember he wasn't there to hear it. But slowly, with the support of her children and the passage of time, Florence began to find her footing again. She threw herself into her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, finding purpose in helping raise another generation. She took up gardening with renewed interest, creating beds of flowers that bloomed from early spring through late fall. She even tried her hand at writing, recording stories of her life with Patrick so that future generations would know the kind of man he'd been, the kind of love they'd shared. On what would have been their 52nd anniversary, Florence visited Patrick's grave with an armful of wildflowers, the same kind she'd carried at their wedding. She sat in the grass beside the headstone, not caring that it was probably undignified for a 74-year-old woman, and talked to him the way she had when he was alive. "The ranch is doing well," she told him. "Peter's sons are taking on more responsibility, and there's talk of one of the great-grandsons wanting to follow in the family business. Mary just sold a series of illustrations to a publisher in San Francisco. She's quite successful now, though she never lets it go to her head. James expanded the store last month. Everyone's healthy and happy for the most part. The family you started is thriving, Patrick. She paused, running her fingers over the carved letters of his name. I miss you. Every single day I miss you, but I'm all right. You were right when you said I'd survive this. I am surviving, though there are days when it feels like that's all I'm doing. Still, I keep going. I keep living because that's what you'd want me to do. Because there's still joy to be found, still family to love, still sunrises to watch over the hills we love together. The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and Florence smiled through her tears. She liked to imagine it was Patrick's way of responding, of letting her know he was still with her in the ways that mattered. Florence lived for another 5 years after Patrick's death. Years she filled with family and friends and quiet contentment. She was beloved by everyone who knew her. This strong, kind woman who'd survived so much loss, and yet never lost her capacity for love and joy. She watched more great-grandchildren be born, saw Peter's ranch expand and prosper, attended Mary's first major art exhibition, and helped James through the early years of the Great Depression when his store struggled but ultimately survived. On a spring morning in 1935, Florence woke feeling different. Not sick exactly, just tired in a way that went bone deep. She was 79 years old, and she'd lived a longer life than most, a better life than she'd once thought possible. She got up and went through her usual routine, but everything felt muted somehow, like she was already 1 foot out of this world. That evening, surrounded by family who'd gathered for Sunday dinner as they did most weeks, Florence felt a sudden, overwhelming peace. She looked around the table at her children, now all in their 50s with gray hair and grandchildren of their own. She looked at the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at this beautiful, noisy, chaotic family that she and Patrick had created together. And she felt grateful, so deeply grateful for every moment that had led to this. After dinner, she asked Peter to help her to her room, claiming she was tired. But once there, she sat in the chair by the window, Patrick's chair, and looked out at the sunset painting the hills gold and pink. It was beautiful, achingly so, and she felt Patrick's presence so strongly it was almost like he was sitting beside her. I'm ready, she whispered to the empty room. I've lived a good life, a full life. I've loved deeply and been loved in return. I've watched our family grow strong and sure. I've kept going like I promised I would, but I'm ready now, Patrick, ready to be with you again. Mary found her there several hours later, sitting peacefully in the chair with a slight smile on her face, looking out at the stars over the hills. Florence Stanton Kane had passed quietly into whatever came next, leaving behind a legacy of love and strength and family that would continue for generations to come. She was buried beside Patrick in the Coloma Cemetery, their headstones side by side, together even in death as they'd been in life. The funeral drew an even larger crowd than Patrick's had, people coming from all over to pay respects to a woman who touched so many lives with her quiet kindness and indomitable spirit. In the years that followed, as the ranch passed from Peter to his sons, and eventually to their sons, as Mary's artwork hung in galleries across California, as James's store became a community institution that survived the Depression and thrived into a new era, the story of Patrick and Florence was told and retold. It became part of the family mythology, this tale of how their great-grandfather had found their great-grandmother alone and desperate in the snow, and how from that chance meeting had grown a love that lasted a lifetime and created a family that spread across California. The small house Patrick had built for Florence still stood on the ranch property, maintained carefully by each generation as a reminder of where they'd all come from. Young couples in the family would sometimes spend their first year of marriage there, starting their own lives in the place where Patrick and Florence had started theirs. The wildflowers Florence had planted around the house still bloomed every spring, descendants of the original plants she'd tended so carefully. And on certain spring mornings, when the mist hung low over the hills and the sunrise painted everything gold, workers on the ranch would swear they could see two figures walking hand in hand across the property. A tall man and a woman with long hair blowing in the breeze, together still in the ways that mattered most. The legacy of Patrick and Florence Kane lived on not just in their descendants, but in the values they'd instilled and the love story they'd modeled. They'd shown that true love could grow from the darkest circumstances, that kindness to strangers could change the course of lives, that stubbornness and strength could carry you through the worst losses if you just kept going, kept believing, kept choosing love even when it would be easier to choose despair. And it had all started with a cowboy who couldn't ride past a woman in need, who stopped to help when he could have just kept going, who saw past the blood and desperation to the person underneath. It had all started with a woman too stubborn to give up even when giving up would have been easier, who accepted help when she needed it, who chose to trust and love again even though she'd lost so much. From snow and blood and bleeding hands had grown something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human heart. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all.